Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back. This is the pre-recorded lecture for class number 4, the use of space and fiction in art. Okay, so the agenda for this class is, first of all, to watch the Library of Babel Blender exercise online that I made last week and upload your screenshots, drawings, and even some renders to Moodle before class so we can have a look at them together. The second item on the agenda is I'll download all these images and we'll have a look at them. Third, we're going to, hopefully talk about some of the ideas from this lecture that you will have watched before class. Fourth, we're going to have a student-led discussion based on the reading for this week, which is an excerpt from Cicin's book, Death's End. Number 5, we're going to have a bonus group activity where we're going to all enter a virtual game environment together and do a sort of group creation project. And finally, I'm going to introduce the 3D modeling task for this week, which is going to be UV unwrapping and texturing. Okay, so just to remind you from last week, the class exercise was to see if you could model a Library of Babel based on the story by Jorge Luis Borges. And I uploaded a tutorial that shows you one way to do it, which was procedurally generating a torus shape using a basic monomer of a hexagon. And then, because we're working procedurally with modifiers, you can add detail just to one hexagon and it will sort of repeat throughout your structure. And as always, when you're working, don't be afraid to delete things and start again. There's no wasted materials in virtual 3D space. And upload your screenshots to Moodle and any other conceptual sketches you have. It'll be great to see them. So I hope by class we'll get to see some interesting results. Okay, moving right along to the lecture. So this week, the topic of the lecture is the use of space and fiction in art. So the text that we're talking about this week is an excerpt from Cicin's Death's End, which is part of the three-body or Santi trilogy. The excerpt that I've chosen describes astronauts encountering a pocket of four-dimensional space. For those of you who haven't read the book, let alone the entire trilogy, I won't put any plot spoilers in this lecture. I simply want to focus on what I think is a very brilliant description that Liu makes of four-dimensional space. In this lecture, I will briefly introduce some of the fascinating aspects of four-dimensional space, and we will reflect on how some of these ideas have actually appeared in most of the stories we've looked at so far, from us trying to conceptualize how Ted Chiang's cosmology worked with the Tower of Babylon, to trying to conceptualize what sort of shape Borges's Library of Babel would have. Now onto Cixin Liu and the very literal description that he tries to offer of encountering four-dimensional space. And I want us to have a think about, how this reconfiguration of our own spatial experience can be used as an expressive device in both art and storytelling. And then to conclude our examination of space and fiction, in today's lecture, I'm going to introduce 3 contemporary artists who have all used spatial fictions and world building as part of their practice. By introducing the work of these 3 artists, I want you to start to think for yourself about how the creation of spatial fictions might be an interesting creative approach that you can take in your own work. In my own art practice, I often create fictional characters and fictional worlds as a way to express ideas and emotions. When you have a fictional character, we can make them do things that we would not ordinarily do. We can direct their behavior and their actions as a form of creative expression. And we can make a whole world based around characters that helps us articulate, exaggerate, and learn about ideas that often might be very hard to explore in our everyday reality. So this idea of creating fictions just for an artwork can be a really nice container into which you can put your own ideas and rearrange them using other characters and other worlds that can have properties and qualities specific to these worlds and characters you create. Before discussing these artists, I would also like to now give a short introduction into some of the concepts of four-dimensional space and how these concepts from physics and mathematics flow throughout the texts we have looked at so far. And I'd also like to then connect this to our general topic in this module, which is perspective, observation, and spatial construction. Okay, so I've just swapped over back into Blender here, and I'll see if I can explain some of these basic principles of spatial dimensions from 0 dimensions to 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, and 4 dimensions using some of the familiar properties that we've been looking at in our 3D modeling introductory exercises. So if I take this first cube, I've just got a little room set up with a light pointing at the cubes, projecting shadows on the wall. If I grab this first cube, we have what we call a three-dimensional polygon, a prism three-dimensional shape. This shape, as we know in 3D modeling, is comprised, if I go into edit mode, of vertexes. I can grab one vertex here. It's composed of lines, which is the interval between two vertexes, and faces. Okay, so if I break down this cube into these components, we'll also have a hierarchy of different spatial dimensions. So I'll show you what I mean. So if I take this cube and I select a bunch of faces, and just leave one left, we have now a two-dimensional shape, right? It's no longer a cube, it's a square. It's a two-dimensional plane. And you can also see that it's no longer casting a shadow on the wall behind, because where I've got the camera positioned is shining directly across this plane, so that it doesn't have any depth with which it can cast a shadow. So now it's projecting its two-dimensionality by the lack of shadow on a wall. Okay, so let's have a look at the next cube, and we'll take that a step further. If I'll do the same thing again, I'll delete a bunch of these faces, but now I'll go into edge select mode and I'll delete 3 of the 4 edges of the plane. And now we have, I guess, what will be a one-dimensional shape. It's just a line. It has no area. It simply has the distance between its two vertexes. And so obviously you can see where this is going. If we take this one step further again, and same thing, delete the faces, and this time I'll just go straight into vertex mode, and I'll delete 3 vertexes of this square. And now we just have a single point in space. And now if I just bring up my move tool, you'll see that point is actually, it's a coordinate in space. It'll have an X, Y, a Z, and a Z value that we could plot on a graph. And this also allows us to see, the situation of this, 0-dimensional point in 3-dimensional space. We have our axes here, our y-axis in green, our x-axis in red, and our z-axis in blue. And here we can kind of see the spatial dimensions that we're most familiar with here, moving from 3 to 2 to 1 to none. Okay, so now how would we represent 4-dimensional space in Blender? Well, by definition, it's a 3-dimensional, it's rendering a simulation of a 3-dimensional space on our 2-dimensional screen. And we can't physically build 4-dimensional spaces in this, but we can kind of explain it via these sort of collapsing of dimensions. So we'll just come over here where I've set up a second scene. It's a bit dark. I might just bring a light over. So we can see what we're doing. Okay, so I've set up this scene with a group of people, and we have, 4 people looking at a sphere. However, if these 4 people who are currently living in 3-dimensional space lived in 2-dimensional space, so if I kind of, squish them down so that their lives are just on this 2-dimensional plane, the depth dimension of the sphere would become imperceptible to them. And so if this sphere sort of entered their world, I'll show you sort of what they should see would essentially be a circle. That if these 4 people here lived in a 2-dimensional world, then any 3-dimensional object would be perceived to them in 2 dimensions. And to complete the fun of the way this is often described, where's my hand? If I bring down this giant hand here, we should have the same sort of phenomenon that if these people are 3-dimensional, they would see this giant hand, and if it intersected with the ground, it would still look like a hand being stuck in the ground. However, if these people were back in their 2-dimensional lives, the hand also would appear to them as, circles intersecting their world. You can see the entire shape of the hand is gone, and all we have are the circles made by the fingers as they touch the ground. So this is kind of a pretty classic demonstration of our inability to perceive higher spatial dimensions, given that we also live our lives perceiving 3-dimensional space. So if we come over here to my third example, sort of same thing again. I've given a representation of a 2-dimensional shape here. We have the blue plane, a 3-dimensional shape here, which is the red cube. And then the green shape here is sort of an animated preview of what a 4-dimensional shape should hypothetically look like. In this case, we have the transposition of these 2 cubes, and as the 4-dimensional, what's called hypercube or tesseract, moves through space, we see that much like in the shadow of the 2-dimensional shadow of the 3D cube, we see that the faces here are warping according to the laws of perspective. So a face that is further away from the light is smaller on the 2-dimensional plane of this wall. And in the 3-dimensional space here, we sort of see a perspectival warping in 3 dimensions of the 4-dimensional shape. So I'll just pop out of Blender and go back to the slideshow. Okay, so I hope that demonstration in Blender was useful. So to summarize, what we sort of have when we're talking about 4-dimensional, 3-dimensional, 2-dimensional and 1-dimensional space is sort of this copying over of properties that we understand from a particular dimension and sort of multiplying them on top of one another in order to understand a higher dimension. So this shape that we talked about, a tesseract, or a hypercube, is one sort of basic example of visualizing a 4-dimensional shape based on its 3-dimensional counterpart. Just as we simulate or image a 3-dimensional cube on a piece of paper by overlapping 2 squares and joining the diagonals together, we can simulate and imagine a 4-dimensional hypercube by overlaying 2 3-dimensional cubes in 3D space. But because we perceive space 3-dimensionally, this can be very difficult for us to visualize. So I hope that explanation in Blender was a little bit helpful. And if you'd like to learn more about it, I really recommend this video by Zac Star, which I'll put the link in the description. And what Zac Star points out is that even though these things are very difficult for us to visualize because we are, very three-dimensional beings, in mathematics, it's far more straightforward to calculate the parameters of much higher dimensions than three, 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions, 6 dimensions, and so on. So for those of you who are interested in learning more about four-dimensional space, as I said before, I'll put a link to this fantastic video by Zac Star in the description. Okay. So during our live chat session, 2 students from the class will lead a discussion on how the science fiction author Liu Cixin uses language to describe four-dimensional space, and how it's experienced by the fictional characters in the novel Death's End. In our discussion, I'd also like to see if we can start to relate Liu Cixin's description of four-dimensional space to the concept of the Aleph that I introduced in the lecture last week. If you remember, the Aleph was a tiny sphere that could contain an entire universe where every person and every object could be seen simultaneously from every direction at one moment in time. So yes, I very much look forward to our live discussion on four-dimensional space and Liu Cixin's text. But for now, I'd like to return to this idea of artists who use fictional spaces and narrative constructions as a central medium in their creative practice. The first artist I'd like to introduce is Paul Noble. Paul Noble is a British artist who, from around 1998, started exhibiting this project called Knobs and Newtown, which was expressed in very large-scale drawings, and it was this sort of imaginary city that, through its architecture, started to tell a story. Now, one thing you'll notice is the way that he drew this story is using, most of the time, what's called an oblique perspective construction. And we'll talk about oblique projection a little more next week when we look at Chinese scroll paintings and computer games and different forms of spatial construction. But I'll just sort of mention briefly one of the reasons I think that Paul Noble used oblique projection to make his imaginary city is that, much like Chinese scroll painting, oblique projection has the advantage that because there's no vanishing point, and by that I mean horizontal lines all remain parallel to each other, they don't converge to a vanishing point, and diagonal lines also remain parallel without converging to a vanishing point. Because of this parallel property, oblique projection allows you, much like a scroll, to continue extending the space both on the x-axis but also on the y-axis. So with oblique projection you can tile a space together, and I think for Noble the ability to make a world that he wanted to endlessly extend was very well suited to the way that he's used oblique projection. So for over 10 years, Paul Noble expanded the imaginary city of Knobs and Newtown. This city has no inhabitants in the drawings, but the ruins of its buildings slowly tell the story of this imaginary civilization or city that he's created. And if you look very carefully at the architecture of Knobs and Newtown, you'll see that the buildings actually spell out the names and purposes of each structure. So in the image that's on screen at the moment, you'll see that it spells out N-O-B-S-L-U-M, or Nobslum. Most of the buildings and places in Knobs and Newtown have the prefix Nob because they're part of Knobs and Newtown. And then the second part of the word generally describes what they are. So here we assume that this is the poor part of town, the slums of Knobs and Newtown. So these images here are the entrance to Knob Park, and a lot of Paul Noble's project has been catalogued by, I guess, a fan blog by Duncan McLaren, his unofficial guide to Knobs and Newtown, which if you're interested, I thoroughly recommend reading through. The URL is at the top of this screen. And This is a quote describing Nob Park from the Contemporary Visual Arts Journal, issue number 23, also quoted from McLaren's website. Nob Park, it's treeless and empty of wildlife. A tent similar to the one on offer has been blown away. The knob rocks that were weighing down the canvas edges have been strewn to reveal a skeletal framework. Nob Job Club is in the background, on a plateau, a barren dome flanked by disturbing grids. I turn away from the desert. The big-eyed hare rearing up on hind legs intimidates me now. It makes me feel guilty. Am I implicated in the destruction of the countryside just because I thought for a moment I might like to camp for a night in Nob Park? That seems a bit harsh. So here we have a critic reflecting on the almost like the tableau or the scene that Noble has created, trying to piece together a narrative from the animals that are now inhabiting this ruined park to the fragments of human habitation such as abandoned tents, ruined buildings and cut down trees. From Noble's 2004 exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery, he presented the sprawling architectural ruin of Nobson Central, which was reminiscent of perhaps a European city destroyed during the Second World War, or as some other critics have suggested, some of the cities in the Balkans that were destroyed during the conflicts of the 1990s. In Nobson Central, part of the ruins spell out the fragments from T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, starting with the lines, "April is the cruelest month." On McLaren's blog, he does a fantastic job of trying to work out exactly how to read the text of Nobson Central. McLaren realises that Noble deliberately leaves out a lot of words and letters so that only traces of these texts remain. So Noble does to the texts much like what he does to the architecture. He crumbles it into pieces so that all that's really left of Nobson Newtown and of T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land are fragments and ruins. So on screen here is McLaren's very careful transcription of the exact lettering of T.S. Eliot's poem that appears in the giant drawing of Nobson Central. I think Paul Noble uses the fictional city of Nobson Newtown as a sort of container, and in this container he collects and rearranges his thoughts about history, about cities, and about the things that can happen in so many different places and times that it's often hard for us to put them all back together into a narrative that makes sense to us. Noble connects them all together by making this new city of ruins just for himself, where it's almost as if we're seeing him rearrange his thoughts in the form of a city that then we as viewers can explore and try to decipher and understand. The next artist I'd like to talk about is the Chinese artist Sulphate and her work RMB City. RMB City is an imaginary Chinese city that Sulphate and her team at Vitamin Creative Space started to build within the virtual world Second Life, which Second Life was started by Linden Labs. Sulphate has used this imaginary city as a virtual film set for making animations, what we usually call machinima, but has also used it as a site for hosting virtual performances, quite similar to what I'd like to do with you this afternoon in Gary's Mod. In RMB City, Sulphate, quite like Paul Noble, has collaged together various fragmented ideas of urban space into a single virtual city. RMB City is much more chaotic in its structure than Nobson Newtown, and it sort of appears to be an absurdist rubble of city components rather than something that we could consider to be an organised city, or in the case of Nobson Newtown, the ruins of a once organised city. In the interview that I'm quoting this video from Art 21 in 2011, Sulphate compares aspects of RMB City to a traditional Chinese brush painting, in the way that it arranges mountains, misty skies, people and buildings almost like toys or Lego pieces in a highly choreographed virtual world. Sulphate says that this approach to spatial arrangement and spatial organization, she thinks derives somewhere from her upbringing with the particular approach to space and spatial construction in traditional Chinese painting that she argues has some sort of correlation to the way that she instinctively wanted to arrange components within Second Life. Okay, so I'll move on to the next artwork, but I'll put the link in the description to this video interview that you can also watch in your own time if you're interested. The final artwork I'd like to introduce is the project Flat is the New Deep by Sun Woo Hoon and Mi Jun Pak from 2018. In this work, the artists utilized the vertical scrolling nature of the web browser, the endless extension on the y-axis, combined with the extendability of isometric projection. We'll talk about this in our next class. Isometric projection is of a similar class to oblique projection in that all parallel lines remain parallel. I'll go into more detail on this next week, but it has the same benefit as oblique projection, that it allows artists to create these endlessly extendable spaces that appear a lot, especially in real-time strategy computer games, that SimCity sort of look. But okay, so in this work, the artists utilize the vertical scrolling of the web browser combined with isometric projection to create an imaginary city that shifts between representations of buildings to the representations of phone screens and digital landscape and graphic user interfaces. As the viewer scrolls down through this virtual world, they travel decades through the political history of South Korea, from the Gwangju uprising in the 1980s to the Me Too movement and contemporary political events in South Korea. So, whilst this is not so much a complete fantasy city in the case of Paul Noble, it's kind of somewhere in between. It's a fictional construction, a spatial construction that also seems to function as a container for the artists to recombine concepts, historical moments, and future fantasies into a newly organized thought that takes the form of this new arrangement of spatial poetry. So that's where I'd like to conclude the lecture for this week. We've discussed some of the technical elements of four-dimensional space and introduced three artists who use spatial construction much in the same way that the authors that we have been looking at so far in our lecture series have done. And this is the transition I'd like you to think about now. We've read some fantastic texts that show how intellectual exercises in spatial construction can become an expressive device for artists and writers. And now we've looked at three artists who also use spatial construction as sort of a container within which they can organize and experiment with their thoughts. So I look forward to seeing what you've been doing in Blender this week. I look forward to our discussion of Cixin Liu's representation of 4D space, and I look forward to our collaborative exercise in Gary's mod this afternoon. Okay, bye for now.